All right, folks. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I know we've been really looking forward to this conversation, and we're so excited to share it with you and with our fantastic conversationalists today. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and acknowledge that we gather on the traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. Let's take a moment tonight to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe, a people who are still here, continuing to bring their heritage to light. Additionally, acknowledging that we're on native land is just a start. So if you are able, consider donating directly to realrentduwamish.org to help support Duwamish outreach and cultural life. Joining us this evening, Dr. Chetan Sashadri serves as Director of Seattle Tuberculosis Research Advancement Center, aka CTRAC, the good folks making this possible this evening, and is an assistant professor in the Division of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. The Sashadri Lab at the University of Washington is focused on studying the role of unconventional T-cell populations in tuberculosis. The lab uses advanced techniques in human immunology and computational biology to characterize immune responses during infection and vaccination with mycobacteria. Vidya Krishnan is an award-winning journalist who has been reporting on medical science for the last 20 years. She's written for The Atlantic, The LA Times, and The Caravan. She was a 2020-2021 Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and is based in Goa, India. Phantom Plague is her first book, and it is our honor to share this evening with both of these fine folks. Please give them a warm welcome.
For that introduction, Myra, how are we doing on mic and sound? Thumbs up? Louder? Okay. All right, I'll just speak louder.
Just hold it.
Oh, yeah.
That sounds great.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, welcome. Thank you all for taking time out of a busy day, busy evening. It's smack in the middle of like dinner in the middle of the week, and it's just so wonderful to see this turnout. And that people brought their families too. This is exactly what we wanted. So I'm thrilled to be here. I wanted to introduce Vidya, but let me just briefly say something about CTRAC first. We're really excited that we have this program here and that we were able to co-host Vidya's visit with the School of Public Health and the Department of South Asian Studies. I want to make a plug that Vidya is doing another event tomorrow at the School of Public Health just down the street at the Hans Roslin Center, focused not necessarily on TB, but on medical apartheid. It's called Plagues, Philanthropies, and something else.
End of imagination.
End of imagination. And so I invite you to attend that as well. It's a fantastic partnership between sort of multiple people in the Seattle and UW community to bring someone like Vidya here and have this kind of event. TB being the focus is also, it's kind of incredible that it brought this many people out on a Wednesday evening. It's not kind of I think those of us who think about it and talk about it sort of don't do it for the sex appeal, just saying. It's really insidious. TB kills 1.5 million people a year. It's like 2 to 3 people every minute. It's killed way more people than HIV and COVID-19 will ever kill, just because it's been with us for so many thousands of years just doing this. And yet, most of us don't think about it. And it's because you may not personally have that experience, because in this country, we've largely controlled it. But in most of the rest of the world, and that's really what Vidya has written this book about, it's a tremendous problem, and it's an unfair problem in terms of who's bearing the brunt of that misery. And so I really look forward to having that conversation with Vidya. To introduce Vidya. So we're thrilled that she's here. She's an investigative journalist. She's based out of India. She's written not just about TB, she's written about COVID-19. She's been writing about other health issues. She's written for The Caravan, The Atlantic, The New Yorker. She's really brave. I want to actually just
Or
acknowledge
just
that up
reckless.
front. No, she's faced the kinds of challenges and harassment you should not have to face just because you're doing your job. And maybe she'll talk about some of that stuff. But it takes somebody like that to really get to the bottom of a story and then tell that story. And the fact that someone like that chose to tell a story about tuberculosis, I think is what's so incredibly gratifying to me as a scientist who spent 15 years working on tuberculosis and as a physician who's treated patients with TB. So thank you for being here, Vidya. Can we give her a round of applause? She's not actually going to do a reading. We're going to talk. And I've marked out a whole bunch of sections in this book. And then maybe I'll just have you read some of those passages.
Happy to.
Okay. So my first question for you is actually just before this book, I just kind of wanted to get an understanding of how or why did you decide to become an investigative journalist? And for someone who doesn't know, how is that different from a non-investigative journalist?
That's actually a good question. All journalism should be investigative, but newsrooms are structured weirdly. And so you have regular beat journalists, which is a lot like how a city looks at how a city organizes itself, is how newsrooms organize themselves. So, how police officers have beats, journalists have beats, and health is a soft beat as against conflict or defense or politics. These are like hard beats that sell newspapers. And why I became a journalist, that's all I wanted to be. I remember at some point in my early teenage years understanding that people grow up and then they have to earn money, and to do that whole thing they have to pick something to do. And this was the thing I picked, and I've just always, to me, literature and journalism kind of is the way to orient myself with the world, and newsroom just helps me make sense of a world that's increasingly difficult to make sense of. If that answers
Okay.
the question.
I guess my follow-up question then is, and maybe you already alluded to this, was it clear that you would be writing about health issues, or did you write about other things too?
I wanted to become a sports journalist and travel with the Indian cricket team. That's all I wanted.
Wow, you are far from that.
I'm very, very far from that, but I grew up in Bhopal after the gas tragedy. I don't know how many.
Yeah, I don't know how many people might know about that. So
It's in 1984, an entire central Indian town was gassed overnight. This was 2 years before Chernobyl, and this was a pesticide factory which leaked methyl isocyanide. So half the city died of cyanide poisoning overnight.
And this was Union Carbide.
Union Carbide. So the parent plant was in West Virginia, which had all the safety systems before they outsourced the plant to India, but without the safety systems. And at that point, India was just like newly independent, and we are an agrarian country, so we needed more pesticide to be agriculturally self-sustaining. And so this plant came to be, but then it didn't have the safety measures that were in the parent plant in West Virginia, and half the city died. And I grew up in the shadow of this mass atrocity. And increasingly, like as you grow, when I got into a newsroom, I realized most of India has also forgotten the story of people of Bhopal. Because, in 91, we opened our economy, and then the internet came in, and, no one wants to hear these sad stories, and you want to move on, and you want to be the country which is a big market and a developing economy, and all of those exciting things. And what you leave behind are these kind of tragedies, which then don't have a place in popular memory. So when I became a journalist, I was in Delhi, which is where all the exciting, it's like becoming a journalist and being in BC, which is different from being a journalist and being in some armpit village of the country. But then I went back to Bhopal because at that point the story was unfolding in the city's hospitals and in the courts. And we now have third generation survivors who have genetic mutations from cyanide poisoning because it crossed the blood-brain barrier. And I've seen fetuses which have like webbed fingers. And the city is still suffering. And it taught me a lot about the kind of journalism that I wanted to do, which essentially is about mass atrocities still, but different kinds of mass atrocities now.
Okay. And so then at this time, clearly this was a formative experience for you, and I can see how it put you on the health beat. But was TV there? Was TV part of that background and that experience?
No, because TV was always there. In India, there's always TV, but it's also not there because there's also HIV and malnourishment and stunting and polio and all sorts of
Diarrheal diseases.
Yeah, in India you have all of these things at the same time with competing interests. So TV is one of those things, but it's only in. It's actually more recent. It was in the book. It's turns out to be the 7th chapter, but everything else in the book is to be able to tell the story of this young teenager who had to sue the Indian government to access the latest anti-TB drug. And I realized to be able to tell the story of this one kid, I would have to just go around the world and talk about Dracula and all of those things that I had to do to kind of make. As a writer, my challenge is TV is not an easy thing to get someone to get the reader hooked onto. You can't convince a lot of people to put your money on a book about a disease that nobody cares about. Just nobody cares about. So I did like how you'll see in the book that the first portion is essentially about literary criticism and Victorian fashion and Sherlock Holmes and all sorts of pop culture thing you could cram into. And then I was just hoping if you're like 150 pages in.
You're gonna finish it now.
Yeah, it's just gonna be like might as well, So that's my trick.
Successful trick. Can I get a show of hands? How many people have read the book? Okay, great. I do want to make sure that there's time for questions from people in the audience. I don't want to sort of monopolize the whole conversation. So Milo, can you give me a signal or something, and maybe we'll give like 15, 20 minutes for questions. Okay. Wonderful. Let's then get to the book. So the end of the introduction. I think it's a great way to end the introduction. This book has one intended audience: readers who have had the good fortune to have remained ignorant of TB, but can ill afford to do so any longer. And then it starts, right? And it just like doesn't let you go. Like she said, it starts with Dracula. I'm not going to say anything else about it. I'm not going to have any questions about Dracula. I actually wanted to sort of move on from there because you sort of also go into, for me, near and dear to my heart, is kind of a history of infectious diseases, right? Just the idea that there are microbes that cause disease and that it isn't just you forgot to wear a sweater and it was cold outside or got rain. I mean, all these sort of like environmental explanations for why people are getting sick was sort of just the way it was until people really thought about germs, discovered germs, and then proved germs. And you go through some of that history. Why did you feel like you had to go that far back to tell the story of TB?
Thank you for that question. I was writing this book at a time. I mean, it's a searching question. This one too. Why I had to go that far back is I was the health and science editor for the Hindu, which is India's version of the New York Times. It's our paper of record. And I was their health editor, and every time I had to write like a short story, 300 words or 400 words, and India is the highest burden country with TB, but India is also the pharmacy of the world. We have generic drug manufacturers, and there is no reason why we should have the kind of crisis that we have with drug-resistant TB, but also drug-sensitive TB. And every time I try to sell this story to my editor, like in an edit meet, that there is a saying in the newspaper that to kill a good idea, you take it to edit meet. So I would go to these edit meetings, and it was impossible for me to explain to my editor also why this is a problem that should be on the front pages. Or why, as a health editor, I would fight for like real estate center spread in the weekend edition or whatever's the real estate in a newspaper. And eventually, we now have a right-wing government in India. And eventually, for every short story that I write, we'll get a legal rejoinder from the health ministry. And with newspapers, it is one of those things where would you rather take on the government over tuberculosis, or would you rather take on the government on the defense policy, or something more journalistically more heroic? And TV would never make that cut. So eventually I quit that job, and increasingly I had to do everything that you read in the book is the only way I could explain the story to me. Because I was not writing it for someone. When I started writing it, I didn't have a publisher. In fact, I didn't think there would be an audience this far away from home for a story like this. So all of it at that point was me just colonized by this story, and me waking up every morning and seeing TB patients and going to underfunded hospitals in Mumbai and not knowing what to do, and always ending up with very generous TB patients who would always share their stories with me, not because they had something to gain from it, but because they were like, tell other people so this doesn't happen to them. Because even in India, even in Bombay, when someone gets diagnosed with TB, they're shocked that this is a problem. They're shocked that this is not curable, because all the information that you have about TB is just so, it doesn't match the moment. There are these popular myths about TB that's a disease of one organ and it's curable, and it mostly affects poor people. And at this point, all three things are just so wrong. It's difficult to manage, it's expensive to cure, and it's not a disease of one organ. Most people don't know it. And I had to just get this book out of my own body. And then I will say it's taken a life of its own, and I'm glad that it has resonated with a lot of people.
Well, part of the reason I ask is because I actually think TB goes back to that beginning. I mean, you go through that history, but in fact, of the diseases that were identified as having a germ cause, TB was like right there at the beginning. So it actually is the beginning of sort of microbiology and infectious diseases as we know it and take it for granted now. And you tell that story, I think, really beautifully and elegantly. And Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes make an appearance. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that because you got to read the book. But I'll move forward. There's that. Then you come to sort of the part about how once people start to realize this, then they realize that it could be spread through unhygienic measures. And so the idea of sort of practicing hygiene, infection control sort of starts there. And I actually learned something from that story, even though I've heard it many times. So, in particular, you spend a fair amount of real estate in this book. Kat, in fact, I think there's a whole chapter named for him, Dr. Semmelweis. So why don't we actually read something about Dr. Semmelweis? I marked something, but maybe you have a particular passage that might be.
What did you mark?
Here, I'll show you what I marked. I think the passage that I marked, I think you have to give a little bit of background for.
Yeah.
However,
Yeah. So Dr. Semmelweis was. It's a sad story. He was right, but he was just rude and impolite and flawed, and had the personality of just a grumpy old man. And he was good to his patients, but he was not a good is not good at communicating what he was doing. So I'm just going to pick this up.
And the thing that he found, that the real discovery he had was women, after they gave birth, oftentimes they died of sepsis, they died of infection. And it was sort of taken for granted, like, hey, if you're gonna have kids, you're just, living on the edge. But in fact, it had everything to do with the practice of delivering the baby and not being sort of, sterile and all this other stuff. But nobody would listen to it.
Yeah, and we see this bit over and over again with TB as well. This chapter is here because how much evidence is evidence enough for us to do the right thing? It talks to a lot of things. I'm going to read a portion of it where we have data that he's saving lives, but he's just doing it in a way where if you don't wash your hands, he's just right there saying. And then there are these gentlemen doctors of Victorian era who are just offended at being told that they are disease carriers. And here goes. However, he did not publish a paper about his findings. Never the crowd pleaser, he disliked public speaking and writing, which made it difficult to secure recognition for his discovery and went against the grain of academia's long-standing publish or perish culture. With the concept of germs yet to be discovered, Semmelweis lacked the framework to explain his breakthrough, and the lack of explanation became the reason to argue against his discovery. Semmelweis soon became adamant to a degree that inevitably caused offense. He started publicly berating people who disagreed with him, and he made influential enemies. Eventually, the doctors gave up chlorine hand washing, and Semmelweis lost his job. Making matters worse, the year after his breakthrough in 1848, there was an uprising in Vienna against the Austrian Empire, and Hungarians, like Semmelweis's family, began to be mistrusted. Although there is no evidence that Semmelweis was a part of the revolution, many of his students and at least one of his siblings were. In 1850, he left the city without saying goodbye to anyone. He returned to Hungary and for the next decade faced relentless ridicule for his ideas about hand washing. Semmelweis, now without a job and infuriated, started writing open letters to prominent obstetricians, accusing them of being murderers. In 1861, he wrote about it that most medical lecture halls continue to resound with lectures on epidemic childbed fever and with the discourse against my theories. In published medical works, my teachings are either ignored or attacked. The medical faculty actually awarded a prize to a monograph written in 1859 in which his teachings were rejected. Semmelweis's research and style were too radical and too impolite. His ideas, like him, were an affront to the self-esteem of the illustrious doctors of the gentleman classes. His methods of using statistics as medical evidence was not understood or accepted. The centuries-old thesis that diseases spread by miasma or contagion was too deeply rooted. Isolated and mocked, Semmelweis was not, however, entirely alone. At some point in the same decade, thankfully for all humanity, a French, a German, and an English scientist walked into a lab.
Is this just a nice story, or is there a lesson there for us now? Why did you tell that story?
Thank you for that question. There are so many lessons in Semmelweis's story. One of it is just, I study sociology, I'm a journalist, so I'm fascinated by human behavior. And I'm fascinated by how you have to be polite on top of being right to convince someone to do the right thing. But in this particular chapter, what you see is the next portion talks about Pasteur and Lister and Robert Koch, the German, English, and the French clinicians who walked into a lab famously. And we now have this culture of talking about last week, the scientist who developed the mRNA vaccine was
Yeah.
given Nobel. And all of that is true. And science so rarely is this eureka moment of one person. We love these as storytellers. I know that we love stories of this single genius, who came and saved the world, the hero who solved all our problems. But science is not that. Science is boring, incremental, work where you're just hunched over a lab day after day after day, working through back pain and all of those things, those boring things. And with Semmelweis's story, I hope the readers take many things from that back about magical thinking or about interpersonal relationships or how you work with flawed human beings all the time. But one of the things I really hope you take, what happens later is there was this war, and it was something like the space race that you see, but it was about between Pasteur and Koch, and there was the German and the French factions, and each cheering their scientists on. It was the golden age of science, and there were a series of antibiotics discovered. All of that happened, but when you want to look at one hero, what you don't look at the systems that you need to produce those heroes. And we need that desperately right now. We don't need single heroes right now. We don't need saviors. We need systems right now.
I'd have you read that passage because I think
I feel like I've been set up for something.
You were being set up. Because I think the practicing scientists in the audience heard that passage, and we know people like Semmelweis today.
Yeah, sure.
And it's true. You can't just be right. Like you can't be right and be a jerk about being right, and then like everything works out swimmingly for everybody. And it's just part of this sort of human nature thing. And I think what I struggle with a little bit is we know scientists like this, and it's like coalition building. It's actually no different. Being a scientist, being a practicing scientist, having an idea, being out on the edge of the frontier of knowledge, where you're discovering new things, you don't do that alone. You are part of a community. And if you're going faster than everybody else around you, you're going to go alone and you're going to get hurt, or you're going to be really upset. You have to bring everybody with you. You're going together.
Yeah.
And it is an exercise in coalition building. And that's actually a big ego check, right? Because you have to, just like in coalition building, you have to acknowledge, even though you don't want to, I might be wrong a little bit in this place, and you might be a little bit right, even though I think you're actually totally wrong, so that we can go together. And he didn't do that at all. Didn't even try.
No, he was. My heart goes out to him, particularly because he lost his job initially because he was rude, but his findings were correct. But then first he was demoted, then he was fired, then he just started calling his peers murderers. Then he just lost his plot, and then eventually people would just not listen to him.
Yes.
And then he would just start accosting young couples on the street saying, when you get pregnant, you ask your doctor to wash his hands. And people were just a little crazy, man, get away from me. And then that's when his story also does get sinister, because he was just so sure about what he'd found, but without the language to explain it to people. Eventually, his wife had to check him into an asylum where he was beaten while trying to escape, and he died from the same sepsis. And it's like a very tragic, like a poetic injustice.
Literally a Shakespearean play that has to be written.
Tragic in many ways. But I'm not particularly against people who go, who race ahead. And I myself am a freelance journalist, and I put this book out. This book is a collection of all the things newspapers in my country are not allowed to say anymore. And I'm a big fan of the lone wolf, big ego, I will go and alone and do this. And but the thing is, it does need a village. Once you have a story, you need fact checkers and editors and line editors and copy editors and publishers and publicists. And it takes a village to get this to this point. And at some point, I'm a big fan of people who can go alone and do their own thing. But at some point, you have to decide whether this is about you or about the cause. And at that point, you have to, like I say, now this book has a life of its own, and it creates its own conversation. And I have no control over how it's interpreted. And that's the same with science. And I genuinely believe we are at a point where we were talking about the kind of science that sits in a lab. Like, I don't know many of you, if you've read the story by ProPublica, which came out a few weeks ago, which said that in 2018, GSK had a TB vaccine which was shelved. And that kind of science is without beauty. And when you have the kind of science which is just in a lab setting and perfect in like Seattle or Geneva, but completely crashes when it's in India or some Asian or African village, that is useless. That is useless. That proof of concept.
I definitely want to come back to that story because it's near and dear to our hearts, several of us in this audience. But I'm going to go in order of the book. So the book is actually divided into sort of three parts. The first part is kind of what she mentioned, which is you're really excited. It's not really sort of much about TB, and now you're halfway through and you got to finish it. The second part of the book, which I found was just so incredibly compelling, was really sort of the human story. And I think I think you mentioned this was the reporting. This was actually the nucleus of the book initially, and then the rest of it you wrapped around that. So that's where I wanted to go next. And just to mention, the third part of the book sort of talks about, zooms way out, and sort of talks about the structural features around just the way drugs are developed and distributed, protected by patents, incentives that kind of got us to where we are. But let's stick with the second part of the book, and specifically these stories. And so I wanted to, okay, let's do this. Let's do building 10. So this was a story. This must have been like a reporting, and then it evolved. Tell us the story of how that happened.
So this portion of the book is set in Mumbai, which is the hottest of hotspots for.
And I marked this passage for whenever you want to read it.
So this portion is set in Mumbai, in the slums of Mumbai, and a bunch of this book is reported. This portion of the reporting is based on right to information queries from the government, which is the Indian version of Freedom of FOIA Acts, which journalists here as well use a lot in their reporting. And what I found was that Mumbai, if you're familiar with Mumbai at all, is Bollywood is based there. It's the financial engine of India. And we have this romanticized story of Mumbai, which is true for Mumbai, but it's also true for New York and Paris and all of these mega cities of the world, where we built these big cities, and we talk of the subhuman living in those cities, the ghettos and the as if living there is some sort of a obstacle course to your personal rags to riches story. You made it in New York or you made it in Mumbai. And Bollywood in particular has done this thing where, with movies like Slumdog Millionaire, we have many movies that romanticize poverty. And to me, that really does a lot of damage, because this is what it hides. Within Mumbai East, Mumbai is where the largest density of slums in Asia is. And within that, this portion is based in Asia's largest slum cluster, which, to no surprise to anyone, has a huge burden of tuberculosis. And all of this came after the 1990s, when India opened its economy and became a liberalized country. So we looked at free market solutions to house our urban poor. So what essentially we did is cleared out land. A lot of it has happened in, the kind of projects that were built in Chicago. And I've compared the living in India to the kind of health deficits you have if you're African American or immigrant living in the projects. And this is one of those buildings, so I'm going to read this paragraph. One building in particular stands out, building number 10 of the NP compound. Researchers found 51 drug-resistant tuberculosis patients in one building in one of Mumbai's sprawling ghettos, an exceptional find even for a country like India. It's the equivalent of finding 51 people suffering from a rare cancer, all neighbors. At least one member of every family living inside building number 10 had drug-resistant TB, not regular curable drug-sensitive TB, but the kind where the bacteria has stopped responding to antibiotics. Over the next few days, Dr. Pihu, who was taking me around these slums, approached the civil engineering department of the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay, and she wanted to know if the building themselves were causing tuberculosis. And this research was inspired by what's called a trigger photo, where doctors, architects, and government officials came together in ways that genuinely makes one believe in the concept of good governance. The report is a Kafkaesque bill of indictment providing unimpeachable evidence that the slum redevelopment projects are a colossal failure and confirming that one of the hottest of hotspots for drug-resistant TB in Mumbai and also most likely in the world was caused by urban planning. The DFI researchers were alarmed but could not explain why exactly all families in this one building from the same socioeconomic class who earned the same amount of money and lived pretty much in the same way, some of them were getting TB and some of them were not. I'm going to leave it here.
Yeah. So I read that, and I had this moment where I said to myself, what is the point of the scientific discovery if, like, at the end, that's what you're up against? Like, does it even matter if we have new drugs or new vaccines or whatever? Because there are these buildings that are basically designed for people to spread TB to each other. These sort of literally structural features of urban planning. Is that depressing? Are you going to inspire me now and tell me it's still worth going back to work?
I mean, it's I don't know. Optimism is not my brand. I will be honest. But I live in Mumbai. I have family in Mumbai. Reporting this book, I have friends who had TB in Mumbai, and they have all shared their stories generously with me. So people here in faraway parts of the world, like last week, there were stories about how there is tuberculosis in New York. What's happening in Mumbai is just a peak of this era of post-antibiotic era that's dawning on all of us. Mumbai is well connected with flights to every corner of the world, and this is not a Mumbai problem. And I feel it's worth getting up and going there every day because you peddle in medicine, but I peddle in something even worse. I peddle in stories. And there's no use of how do you use a story? And I'm biased and I just have to believe that, there is power in there is people will find solutions if you tell powerful stories. And that's what this book tries to do about science that just sits on a shelf while buildings are stacked with TB patients. That is a failure. That's a failure of a regional government in India because we've had a DOTS policy that's been working for since the 90s. We've had this DOTS policy, which then became a DOTS plus policy, which then was which the targets were not achieved and then got woven into Millennium Development Goals and now is woven into Sustainable Development Goals. And we are failing consistently. And despair at this point, I feel, is also a privilege. And for someone in Mumbai who has, like this doctor who took me on a visit to the clinic in slums, I met this patient who was pregnant and had XDR TB, And she'd come to the clinic after she coughed so much she aborted her fetus. And it's unheard that such, I don't know such a thing could happen. And this doctor took me to her house, and I'll never forget that the only thing in her little matchbox size house room was a stove, but there was nothing to cook. And it's heartbreaking to watch people die when solutions are available, but if you don't talk about it you become complicit in ways that are even more damaging, and you become a part of the problem. And I, for myself, like I can never be a part of that. So this is what I can do. I can turn up every day, and it's been a privilege to, I for days I don't understand why these people who are dying, who know they are dying, and are still challenging the system and still talking to people like me, and they did that, and I want to do it for them.
Well, so let's move to that. So there's, I think, for me, two really compelling personal stories that are really beautifully told. Um, one about a girl named Shreya and one about a girl named Pia. Let's talk. I think you reported on Shreya's story, and then there must have been aspects of that that never made it into the reporting, and you wanted to tell that story here. Is that how that story evolved?
Yeah, so Shreya is the teenager whose story I wanted to. The rest of the book is to be able to tell her story, and she approached the Indian government to access bedaquiline, which is like one of the two drugs that works on drug-resistant TB. And India, it's made in an Indian factory for an American pharmaceutical company. So Johnson and Johnson has the patent on it, but because it's cheaper to make it in India, it's made in an Indian factory. But Indian patients are dying right outside the factory in Nagpur and have no access to this medicine. And Shreya's father worked with the government of India his entire life. He was a civil servant, and then his daughter got contracted this horrible disease, and then the government of India fought him and his family tooth and nail, and they destroyed his family. And I could never reconcile myself with that, because I remember turning up at the court for the hearing, and there'd be MSF activists and there'd be journalists and these poor patients. And by then, this kid was reduced to a wheelchair, but she'd still turn up because she wanted TB patients after her to not suffer this. And the fact, and then of course Shreya died. She didn't get access to, because Indian justice system is also, the process is the punishment. By the time she won the case, but by then her lungs had collapsed and she died. Then her family went back to Bihar. Her family was from Bihar. They went back there, and I think by then the newspapers had reported so insensitively. Again, infectious disease does it. We saw in this country, and my country is the same way. You talk about infectious disease in this stigmatizing way, that the family had to face a lot of stigma. They had to move houses because the landlord did not want them to live. The younger sibling had to move schools because they, and again, she did not have the kind of TB that, she was dead. It doesn't matter what kind of TB she had. And the fact that the Indian Health Ministry dedicated resources to just destroy this family by slow rolling on how access to bedaquiline, uh, all of it just makes me question just the legitimacy of the institutions. What is the point of being a pharmacy of the world if our children are dying from curable diseases? And none of the newspapers wanted to write these things, because India again thinks of itself as this destination, which is a huge market, and we are a country of Gandhi and yoga and Beatles and backpackers, and so you don't want to talk about the horrible drug-resistant TB that you can also contract in India. And it's that's why I wanted to center the story of this teenager in the book.
I mean, it's a devastating read, and I can't imagine it would have made it through the edit room looking the way that it looks in this chapter?
Thankfully, my editors were the book is edited by the first edition was edited by Harshad in New York. So we did not have a lot of editors who understood the politics of India, but there was a lot of conversation about can we say this, can we say that, and again, one of the things about someone you call me brave, I call me reckless, is that you're like a rogue agent and you don't know which way this is going to swing. And I was like, I don't have a job. What are they going to fire me from? I don't care. I want all of this set because I don't know how to, when I was writing the particular chapter after Shreya died, uh, I had to call her mother at some point to talk to her for this book. And her mother asked me this question that where were you the day she died? And of course, I know she died, but I called my friends at MSF and I called the lawyers, and there was this whole community, and we kind of didn't know if we should call the parents. And her mother just told me that I hope you and every doctor and every journalist who watched my daughter die, I hope you watch your loved ones die from this disease, and you have a disease drug that you cannot give to your child and save your child. And she was like, Dad, never call me back. And she hung up on me. And it's in the book, all of that. And it's true. It's true. I didn't call her because I was more uncomfortable with what to do with my grief. And sometimes the decent thing to do is just witness someone else's grief. And at this point, even that's not happening. And with TB, that's a big problem, which is why this book is called Phantom Plague. There is just millions of patients who are just invisibilized, stigmatized. And at this point, the decent thing to do is to bear witness. It wasn't an easy story to write. It wasn't an easy story to edit. And there were a lot of fights in the edit room. But this is a village. It took a village to bring the book here.
No, thank you for that story. I have more questions, but I want to open it up to audience questions, make sure other people get a chance to ask Vidya about stuff that they might be interested to talk about. I still have questions about the third part of the book. Milo, about how much time do we have?
About 15 minutes.
Okay. Are there burning questions, please? Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned the ProPublica article, which was, pretty shocking. And I actually had an appointment for an RSV vaccine that evening, and I was like, oh my God, like I am exactly the person who's taking this limited resource away for something that's a pretty low risk for me. There's this chemical that can be used to produce TB vaccines that's in limited supply. And instead of using it for TB vaccines, they're using it for Shingrix vaccines or RSV vaccines. And
Thank you.
I'd like to hear your comments on that.
And maybe tell a little bit of the story so people kind of get the context, because not everybody has read it.
Yeah. So the context of, first of all, I want to tell you that the problem we have here is decent people are filled with this kind of self-doubt, and we have indecent people who are just taking decisions where it pits health as a zero-sum commodity, where for you to win, I have to lose. It doesn't have to be, this is a falsity. And the thing with this ProPublica story, which by the way, every paragraph of it is, it makes my blood boil to even think about it. So there is, I realized from this brilliant investigation that GlaxoSmithKline, which is a British pharmaceutical company, in 2018 had a TB vaccine, which worked and was profitable, but they shelved it because they realized it would be more profitable as a product in a commercially viable market, which is the global north, which essentially means people who can pay in dollars or euros for, say, Shingrix, for shingles, as against millions of people who can play in Taka or Rupee or, in high-burden countries. And again, the question comes to the economic order of how our global health system functions. But there are so many problems with this story. First of all, I did not know you could do something like that where you have a vaccine and you can just be like, oh, it kills, it's a pandemic, but let's just share it. I didn't know. And secondly, it's happening in 2018. I'm thinking that 2018 is when the first UNHLM on tuberculosis was happening. And the fact that I don't know, the truth is, when you don't have to have evil, you don't have to be evil or have to have malice to inflict catastrophic damage. You just have to show lack of urgency and have to act without empathy. And that's what this story shows, the complete, utter lack of empathy for what's being done to people who don't have money. But then this vaccine is also funded by NIH. That's every part of the story is so problematic that I actually, which is why I'm very excited about these kind of conversation, because even 10 years ago, I don't see a room for someone like me to be at a literature festival or at a university in a public health setting talking about these things, because we need more activism from scientific community. Because for ProPublica, it takes years to investigate it. But I don't understand how people within the scientific community did not know this or did not speak up for this. And it should not have to be a zero-sum game where if you want to be safe from TB, you will get shingles. What is this global health order, especially with taxpayer-funded research? So.
Okay. So what was I knew.
And
I'm a
also, sorry,
scientist.
and also for a British company, for a British pharmaceutical company to sit on a vaccine that kills Indians and post-colonial people, just the bloody optics of this, where, South Africa and India are the most high-burden countries, and you have a taxpayer-funded vaccine with a British company. Can we talk about the optics as well? Like, can people in global health look at how this looks from outside?
Okay, so let's get into some of the details about this, because there are people in the audience who know some of the details too, and I'm going to look at them for some corrections. Scientists like me who are sort of in this sphere knew about this in 2018, and we were actually really excited. I want to actually emphasize something you said. It's not that we don't have a vaccine for TB. We have a vaccine for TB. It's 100 years old, but obviously it doesn't work very well because we got a massive problem with TB. And what was so incredibly groundbreaking about this vaccine is that it works on people that are going to get TB to prevent them from getting TB, and now you just prevented them spreading it to someone who is then going to spread it to someone. It's the first vaccine we've ever had that breaks the chain of transmission. Even the vaccine we use now doesn't do that, which is why we've had a massive problem. I will say that Dr. Ria Kohler played a part in discovering the units that went into that vaccine. So it has, the origins of that vaccine have a deep history here in Seattle. GSK, yes, all that money, including work that was done by Dr. Kohler, was funded by the government. But my understanding is GSK took on the responsibility to conduct the phase 2 trial. That was not government funded. They took that on themselves.
That's correct.
And I don't think they thought it was going to work.
That's also correct.
And then when it did,
Why not?
I don't know.
Why not?
There was a whole body of preclinical data, mouse and guinea pig data, but the non-human primate data that were generated were sort of suspect by some scientists in the field. And there was a lot of discussion about whether it really would work or not. And I think GSK did not think that it would work as well as it did.
But they did it. They put $20 million more into this trial on their own. They did it. They finished it. and they gave us that information. And then
I see
They
the
are
plot
a-
emerging.
they are a publicly traded company. Then you have to make decisions. And the secret sauce of this vaccine is the same secret sauce that is in the Shingrix vaccine and now in the RSV vaccine. So you are a publicly traded company and you are looking at this and saying to yourself, we've got a secret sauce, takes a lot of time, energy, and money to make it. We can put it into a couple of these products. Which ones are we gonna do and which ones are we not? And they made a decision as a company. I see this story from the standpoint of market failure because no company, GSK or otherwise, ever really has an incentive to make a vaccine and see it all the way through to the end. All the way through to the end, to plan for success, because that's what you have to do. When they make a Shingrix vaccine or they make an RSV vaccine, they have a pretty good idea that it's going to work, and they already have plans to file for regulatory approval, to make a gajillion doses of it, get it out to pharmacies. You don't wait till you figure out that it works to then start doing that, because that takes 5 to 10 years of lead time. There was no effort put into this, but they finished it. I give them credit for taking it out and finishing it, and then it was their choice to stop it. I see this as a failure overall, no outcry, no activism on the part of scientists, including us who were there and we heard about it and we were really excited. And then it's, what are you gonna do? And you know who I give a lot of credit to at that moment that stepped in? Was the Gates Foundation. And you are not very nice to the Gates Foundation in this book. I am going to have you read this passage, and then we're gonna talk a little bit more about this vaccine.
This is how you get set up.
I'm not even a reporter.
I'm seeing which portion I'm reading just before I go blindly. So this para or this para?
From here down.
So the Gates Foundation employs former pharmaceutical executives in its top ranks. Dr. Trevor Mundell, who had been the global head of development at Novartis. I'm going to skip through names here. Just, they have similarly the previous vice president of research, vaccine research at Pfizer. Gates became interested in immunization in the late 1990s when Microsoft was facing an antitrust case. He declared war on Netscape, attempting to smother it by bundling Microsoft's own free Internet Explorer browser with Windows and pressuring other companies to use it instead of Netscape Navigator, if you remember those days.
So what I
There's
wanted-
this one sentence, which I'm just going to read.
Go ahead.
My editor spoke about this sentence a lot, and I'm glad it was in the. I say that Gates has the mind of a genius and the morals of a thug, as was evident with the Netscape's abrupt end. He often descends from Mount Olympus to get into fistfights with small companies like Netscape. As Netscape struggled to stay afloat, the US government sued Gates for anti-competitive behavior. By late 90s, Microsoft had been having skirmishes with the Department of Justice for almost a decade. In 1998, Gates testified in front of Congress in a rousing defense of monopolies. The internet was threatening to make his operating system obsolete. And the truth is, Bill Gates, the champion of new ideas, has no qualms killing them if they are not his.
I'll take the book. You keep the mic. So this is the third part of the book, right? This is really the third part of the book. This is really at the heart of why GSK killed the vaccine. I don't know how much time we have to talk about it.
We're running pretty long.
Okay, but
It's so
what's the answer? What's the answer for the next company or group that has a vaccine? Why would they take it all the way to the end?
So, one of these, the First of all, you should never ask me these questions because I have these radical ideas.
That's what we want.
So the thing with patent monopolies, and particularly when we talk of medicine in particular, Western medicine in particular, in terms of, I go into the history of how intellectual property laws developed. And the truth is, the 21st century version of these laws, which is TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property Agreement, is the 21st century version of what began during the struggle for Africa, when the Berlin and the Paris conference were held, where essentially, I forget the year, in 18 whatever, there was a Berlin conference, which is the first congress between the empires of the world to decide how they can carve up their colonies without fighting each other for the loot. So if the British East India Company is taking whatever silk or ivory from India and transporting it, how do you not get into trade disputes with other colonial empires? So what we have now in intellectual property is a descendant of that policy, and what every single medical innovation, which is vaccine or drugs or anything in medicine, is essentially a technology. And we are told in 21st century to think of it as someone specific owns it. And which is why I wrote about the Semmelweis chapter. Lister built on what Semmelweis built, and what Semmelweis did, Pasteur took forward and Koch took forward, and we all stand on the shoulders of giants. But now we have these capitalist neoliberal way of just living, where we are not, especially in the US, Eastern philosophy is slightly different than Western, where Western philosophy is about this individualist achievement, going inwards. And I personally believe that public health and public education are two things where it's not correct to say that private good is good for public as well. It's this way of thinking that if you make private, if you are innovating and patenting things, that somehow will translate into trickle-down economics that goes to everyone. It doesn't. It doesn't. Everything about technology that I know is that more and more you get drone technology, but are drones being used to drop medicines in northwestern Indian villages? No, drone technology is being used to do gender reveal parties, and essentially when they come up as what happens with funding technology, I've seen increasingly in science, is that when it's the seed portion, when you're trying to argue for how much good it can do, you front the social benefit from it. And once you get the funding, it becomes more and more and more myopic, more concentrated in Western benefits, or more inward looking. And then you come to this point that throughout the pandemic, I saw this vulgar conversation about why should we give COVID vaccines to these countries that are freeloading. And I don't know how to have that conversation without talking about every advance that's been made in medicine has come out of experimentation on black and brown bodies. It is true. And I'm not even talking about going all the way back to syphilis. The phase 3 clinical trials for bedaquiline was done by MSF, but also by the government of South Africa and India, because you need drug-resistant TB patients. So we have this bizarre status, and I personally call it necropolitics. That's where we are, where the brown and black nations who have more infectious diseases and the people in black and brown nations have this weird half-life where they're necessary as data, but completely expendable as human beings. So you need them for research, but once you have the product, you're like, the kind of greed that we saw during the COVID vaccination, this is not about patent. This is not simply about patent, because even when you have patent in this country, I was in Boston during the pandemic, and unless you got Walgreens and CVS doling out those free doses, here also you will see the same kind of desperate misery that comes with infectious diseases. And the thing with infectious disease is that it doesn't stop with it, it brings with it all other kind of despair like xenophobia and hate against Asian Americans and fascism and science denialism. And when you keep something like life-saving medicine and you look for reasons that are not moral, when you use the word that it's a market failure, I think it's a moral failure. It's not a market failure. It's a moral crime of our generation. It is violent. It is not at all. The way I see it, there is nothing difference. There is no difference between having bedaquiline and not giving it to someone who has to die, or not having a COVID vaccine or a TB vaccine and letting people die. I don't know how it's different from having penicillin and not giving it to syphilis patients in Tuskegee. I don't see the difference, and it's not a market failure.
You've written a lot on COVID vaccines, but that's tomorrow,
That's
right?
not.
Okay.
We are out
With
of time.
that, I just want to thank Vidya for a fascinating